Hello everyone, hope you're having a beautiful day. Today we'll dive into a deeply emotional chapter in James and Diep's story when a man hiding in the forest dares to return to the village just for a few silent moments beside the woman he loves. You'll see how one crooked bouquet of wildflowers can carry more love and risk than 1,000 words, and how every step he takes could expose them both to danger. If you find this story touching, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next videos. James would always remember the moment his rough, forest-scarred hands laid a crooked bouquet of wildflowers beside Diep's pillow in that little bamboo house he was never supposed to enter again. In that fragile second, he knew he'd gambled everything, his plans, his safety, his future, just to be close enough to watch her breathe. Hours earlier, that same day, the forest had been so still he could hear every dry leaf crack under his boots. His camp was nothing more than a sagging tarp strung between two trees, a blackened circle of stones, and a dented pot balanced over cold ashes. The son of a powerful man had shrunk into a figure in a torn shirt, sleeves rolled up, shoes scuffed and damp from the stream. The forest did not care who his father was. Out here, he was just a fugitive trying not to freeze at night. On a flat rock nearby, his notebook lay open, pages filled with cramped handwriting, names of directors, arrows linking departments, notes on which contracts could be cut, which allies his father needed most, where to strike to weaken the empire that had destroyed their lives. It was his entire strategy to rip control from the old man's hands and buy Diep a future where she didn't have to hide anymore. He tried to read the same line again. The words blurred. Diep's face pushed them aside. He saw her kneeling on the bamboo floor, placing a bowl in front of him with both hands, pretending not to be tired even when her eyes were swollen from crying. He heard her voice, soft and hoarse. "Don't fight him because of me." As if he could rewind time and choose to be a different kind of son. James closed the notebook with a sharp snap. Above him, the canopy parted just enough to show a slice of sky washed in late afternoon gold. If he left now, cutting across the back paths he'd memorized, he could make it to the bamboo house before sunset. It was a stupid idea. A dangerous, reckless idea. His father's men were still asking questions in the village, pushing money across cracked tables, rewarding anyone who whispered the right names. One woman pointing in the wrong direction, one kid staring too long, one familiar face, and they'd track him straight to her door. He had repeated that warning to himself every morning like a prayer. Stay away to keep her safe. But the image of Diep alone in that house, sitting by the small window, listening to every motorbike that passed and wondering if it was him or his father's people. It clawed at him until he could no longer sit still. He stuffed the notebook into his backpack and yanked the zipper closed. With the heel of his boot, he ground dirt over the faint ring of his fire, smoothing out any trace of ash. A few practiced swipes of his hand erased footprints near the rock. The forest had taught him how to disappear as carefully as he'd once learned to straighten a tie before dinner. Backpack slung over one shoulder, he stepped onto the narrow path. The trees closed around him, turning sunlight into scattered patches on the ground. He walked quickly, but not carelessly, ears tuned to every rustle, every shift in the wind. When the normal rhythm of insects and birds broke for even a second, he paused, listening, breath held. Diep's laugh walked beside him. He heard it in his mind when he remembered struggling to fold his long legs on her bamboo floor, when she'd grabbed his wrist during a crack of thunder, pretending she wasn't scared, when she'd once teased him, half serious, half shy. "If you ever bring me flowers, they'd better be ones you pick yourself, not fancy ones from the city." Back then, he'd laughed it off. Now that small sentence felt like a promise he hadn't had the courage to keep. The trees began to thin, the path widening as it spilled out into a sea of tall grass shining under the lowering sun. Beyond the grass lay the fields, the scattering of houses, the thin column of smoke from evening cooking fires. Somewhere inside that messy picture was the tiny bamboo house that felt more like home than his father's mansion ever had. James was about to keep walking when a soft blur of color tugged at the corner of his vision. Just off the path, a patch of wildflowers grew stubbornly among the weeds. Simple white, yellow, and pale purple heads nodded on slender stems, bending with the slightest breeze. They were uneven, imperfect, completely wrong for a polished vase, and yet he could see them, clear as a memory cradled in Diep's hands. He stepped off the path and knelt. His fingers were rough now, marked by rope, bark, and cold water, but he forced them to move gently. One stem at a time, he picked the flowers, making sure not to crush them. A few petals fluttered into his lap. Most clung on, as stubborn as the girl he loved. When he had a small bundle, he tugged a thin cord from one of his backpack straps and wrapped it around the stems. The bouquet came out crooked, some stalks too long, some too short, colors badly arranged. He didn't try to fix it. It was honest. It was his, not the polished boy his father had molded, but the man who now slept under trees and counted the days since he'd last seen her. He imagined Diep waking from an afternoon nap, blinking in the honey gold light that always slipped through her tiny window. He imagined her turning her head on the pillow and freezing when she saw the bouquet lying there tied with a familiar cord, smelling faintly of the forest. No note, no letters, no name. She wouldn't need any. "This is madness," James muttered, staring toward the distant line of rooftops. His pulse beat hard against the fragile stems in his hand. "But I can't stay away from you." He rose, holding the little bouquet as if it were glass, and stepped out of the wildflowers. Behind him, the forest waited, deep and dark and strangely protective. Ahead, the fields rolled toward the village and toward his father's anger. James squared his shoulders and walked toward the light, a fugitive with a crooked bouquet and one impossible goal: to reach the bamboo house before sunset and leave a secret bouquet beside the pillow of the woman he loved. By the time James reached the edge of the village, the sun was already hanging low, dipping everything in a soft orange haze. He slipped off the main dirt track and into the tall grass running alongside it, letting the blades brush against his jeans as he moved. From here, half hidden, he could see without being seen the uneven line of roofs, the thin trails of smoke from cooking fires, the silhouettes of people moving slowly after a long day in the fields. His eyes found it almost immediately. The bamboo house stood a little apart, tucked behind a low fence and a scatter of trees. The first time he'd seen it, he'd thought it looked too fragile for the storms they faced. Now, that same fragile house looked like the only place his heart trusted. Even from this distance, he could trace all its details: the patched roof, the slightly crooked window, the step that creaked when you put weight on the left side. His fingers tightened around the bouquet until the stems dug into his palm. A motorbike clattered down the road. Instinct took over. James sank into a crouch, nearly disappearing into the grass, lowering his head so only the tips of the wildflowers were visible. Dust rose in a cloud as the bike roared past. The rider never looked his way, but James still felt his heart slam against his ribs as if it might break free. His father's voice slid into his mind like a cold hand around his throat. "If you go near that girl again, I'll make sure she regrets ever meeting you." The words had been calm when they were spoken, which made them worse. His father didn't need to yell. He just needed to decide. James stayed in the grass until the engine faded into the distance and the village sounds returned to normal voices, clinking metal, a distant dog barking at nothing. Only then did he move, staying behind the row of trees, circling around the back of the houses, choosing each step as if someone were watching from every window. When he finally reached the narrow side path that led straight to Diep's house, the light had softened into a deeper gold. Shadows from the trees stretched long across the small yard. The front of the bamboo house was still. No clatter of pots, no footsteps. A lone chicken pecked near the fence, then wandered off. Somewhere close by, someone laughed, but it wasn't her laugh. James stayed in the shade of a tree, scanning every corner looking for anything that didn't belong. A strange motorbike, an unfamiliar car, a figure leaning on the fence, pretending to smoke while actually watching. He saw none of it, just the everyday details of her life. The small clothesline, a bucket by the steps, the wooden stool where she sat to peel vegetables, the broom propped against the wall. "It's just you and her," he breathed, barely louder than a thought. "Like before." He stepped into the yard. The dirt beneath his boots felt softer here, as if the ground itself remembered how many times he'd crossed it. He moved quietly, muscles tense, hearing every creak in his own joints, every whisper of the bouquet's petals in the light breeze. At the doorway, he stopped. The wooden frame was worn smooth in places, rough in others. His fingers hovered over it, tracing familiar dents and scratches. He remembered pushing this door open with a bag of groceries, trying to act casual while his heart pounded like it was the bravest thing he'd ever done. He drew a deep breath and gently pushed. The door groaned once, then gave way. Honey-colored light pooled inside, filtering through the small window. Dust motes floated in the air like slow falling snow. And there, on the simple bamboo bed against the wall, lay Diep. She was curled on her side, one arm folded under her head, the other resting near her chest. Loose strands of hair fell across her cheek. Her lips were slightly parted, the way they always were when exhaustion knocked her out faster than she meant to sleep. For a moment, James forgot the forest, the plans, the threats. Everything shrank until there was only the quiet rise and fall of her breathing. He moved closer, stepping carefully on the bamboo floor. Every creak sounded too loud. Every breath felt like it might wake her. At the side of the bed, he sank to one knee. Up close, the small details hurt more. There were faint shadows beneath her eyes, traces of nights she hadn't slept properly. A tiny line at the corner of her mouth suggested how often she pressed her lips together to stop words or tears from escaping. Her hand twitched once on the blanket, like she was reaching for something in her dreams. "Diep," he whispered, the syllable barely formed. "I'm so sorry." Slowly, with the same hands that had learned to build traps and tie knots in the forest, he placed the bouquet on the pillow beside her head. The wildflowers looked even smaller here against the worn pillowcase, but their colors glowed softly in the warm light. They didn't look perfect. They looked like they belonged to them. He stared at the bouquet and pictured her waking up, turning her head, and seeing it the thin cord she'd seen 100 times on his backpack, the uneven stems, the scent of the woods. He could almost see the way her eyes would widen, the way her fingers would hover before she touched them, as if afraid the flowers might disappear. His hand moved before he could stop it. His fingertips brushed her cheek, just enough to feel the warmth of her skin. It was like touching a memory he'd been afraid to trust. He smoothed one stray strand of hair away from her face and tucked it gently behind her ear. Her lashes fluttered. James froze, breath trapped in his chest. But she didn't wake up. Her breathing stayed slow and steady, her body heavy with sleep. "I'm still here," he breathed, his lips barely moving. "I'm still fighting for you, for us." A sudden burst of noise from outside shattered the fragile hush. Footsteps on the road, voices calling to each other, the scrape of something being dragged across the ground. Ordinary village sounds, but to him they sounded like alarms. His body tensed. Every instinct screamed, "Leave, now!" He pushed to his feet and backed away from the bed, unable to tear his eyes from her for a few seconds more. Then he turned, crossing the room in long, careful steps, each one a war between love and survival. Outside, the sky had deepened into streaks of orange and pink. He pulled the door almost closed, leaving it exactly as he'd found it, as if he'd never been there at all. Crossing the yard felt worse than walking toward a firing squad. Every step away from her felt wrong, like he was tearing something inside himself. But every extra second he stayed was another chance for someone to see him, to describe him, to lead his father's fury straight to her. At the low fence, he stopped and looked back. Through the small window, he could only make out the faint outline of the bed and a soft blur of color where the bouquet rested. He swallowed hard, eyes stinging. "Please see it," he whispered. "Please know I risked everything to bring it to you." Then he turned and walked away, his shadow stretching long across the dirt path as he headed back toward the trees and the cold safety of the forest, leaving behind no words, no promises, only a secret bouquet beside the pillow of the woman he loved more than his own future.
James giờ đây đang lẩn trốn trong rừng để trốn tránh người cha quyền lực của mình, không thể ngừng nghĩ về Diệp, cô gái buộc phải trốn tránh vì anh. Tránh mặt người cha, anh lén đến căn nhà tre nhỏ của Diệp và thấy cô đang ngủ. Quá xúc động, anh nhẹ nhàng đặt bố vai bên cạnh gối của cô và vuốt ve má cô. Khi tiếng ồn của làng ngày càng gần, anh buộc mình phải rời đi trước khi bị phát hiện. James biến mất vào rừng, không để lại lời nhắn hay dấu vết nào, chỉ còn lại những bông hoa dại, như một thông điệp thầm lặng rằng tình yêu của anh dành cho Diệp mạnh mẽ hơn nỗi sợ hãi. Còn cách hay quyền lực của người cha anh vẫn còn nắm giữ.